Caroline is professor of, many of you know Caroline, of course. She's professor of culture and psychoanalysis in the School of Arts at Roehampton, where she is based until the end of July this year. She's written widely on psychoanalysis and popular culture, and edits a book series on this theme. Her books as an editor and as an author include The Cinema of Lars von Trier, Feminine Cinematics, Television and Psychoanalysis, and Media and the Inner World, amongst many others. But I think from these titles we can already get a little bit of a flavor of what she works on and what her approach is. She's a founding scholar of the British Psychoanalytic Council and editor of the film section of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And she also practices as a coach and as an organizational consultant. And so I would like to start by asking you how you yourself see, in very general terms, your approach to, let's say, audiovisual culture, which is what we are talking about here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Celestino, and thank you. I want to take time, just a moment, to thank everybody for going to the trouble of reading my work. I realise that it's well outside the usual field of inquiry and theoretical terrain for all of you, so I very much appreciate the effort and time that you've made. Psychoanalysis for me has been fundamental to my development as a scholar. So I originally started out, as some of you know, as a linguist. I studied German and Spanish and was brought into the world of psychoanalysis through optional modules that I took in my final year from the social and political science faculty. And then I went on to do an MA in psychoanalytic theory and then did my PhD on feminism and lucid rigori in particular, and film studies in a Centre for Psychotherapeutic Studies. So I can't really get away from it. It's kind of embedded in my methodological approach. And I think that this is connected to my long-standing fascination with subjectivity and what it means to be a human subject, and the way in which human experience is inevitably impacted, shaped, and indeed now mediated through our encounters with culture and the political ideological frame more broadly. But when I'm using psychoanalysis, and I'm aware that when we were formulating our questions, you kind of raised the issue of the current perennial issue for any psychoanalytic scholar, the question of universals, and aren't we dealing in universals, and what's the limitation of that? And I think that it's important for me. This is a really important question. I've gradually moved away from working with Freudian and Lacanian approaches, or post-Lacanian feminist approaches, which are often, as you'll know, really kind of fixed in their accounts of infantile development or gendered or otherwise differentiated experience. And that's where the currency of universals lies for me, and where it usually applies in the critique of psychoanalysis. And what I've tried to do over the last decade or so is to turn away from that and turn towards object relations theory, very deliberately, actually. And one of the reasons for that is that object relations psychoanalysis actually centers the role of the lived environment in its account of unconscious development and in its account of unconscious experience and emotional lives. So in the object relations psychoanalysis, the role of the object, and here I mean it could be the external object, you know, your actual mother, your actual father, your actual son or daughter, or whether it's the internal version of that object inside the mind, the one that dominates inside of our thought processes and feeling processes that are internal to our mental experience. This is never fixed in the object relations approach. Instead, it's quite the opposite of fixed. It's constantly in flux and constantly, often quite a contradictory kind of play of feelings, relationships, and so on, part relationships as well as whole relationships. So in the object relations account, the idea is that we are constantly shifting our emotional relationship to the object in endless, seemingly endless ways, and often very contradictory ways, as I've said. So a lot of writing around object relations refers to what I can put simply as the messiness of human experience. And the unconscious, I think, is by definition very messy. It's not easy to pin down. It's not easy to explain. It's not easy to comprehend. It's not easy to make sense of in any way. And we often use what Freud described as a process of secondary revision to make sense of any exposure that we might have to the unconscious. So a simple example of this is the way that we narrativize our dreams. So we will all have had that idea of trying to put into words a dream that we had last night or whenever it was, and feeling that something is missing from the account that we're able to put into words. And Freud refers to this as a process of secondary revision. And the messiness, the surplus of unconscious experience is always something that we're in touch with, but can't quite put into words, can't quite put our finger on in terms of representing that mental experience or emotional experience. So this messiness and the complexity of emotional experience, I think it's useful to understand in terms of our relationship with and through objects. And for me, it's not really a case of, and I think not just for me, but inside object relations theory itself, this isn't just about thinking of objects as either one thing or the other, either external or internal. It's both at the same time. So there is an emphasis on a both and kind of logic in an object relations approach that I think is really useful. And I think for me, this really chimes with my approach and my training in how to think about studying culture and the dynamics and politics of cultural experience. So those fundamental cultural studies questions of why this particular thing, why now, why then, why the conjuncture is really important. And this drives the very best of the work that we have in cultural studies, in my view. And I think you do this brilliantly, Celestino, in your work, your recent article on Truman. And you illustrate the importance of the conjuncture so well in the way that you bring your analysis together. And I was reminded when reading that article of Stuart Hall's work, of course, on the conjuncture, and the way in which that cultural context, the cultural processes that we see at work in the conjunctural analysis, the process of conjunctural analysis, we can reframe our understandings according to the environment in which we're working at any given moment. You bring that to life really well in that article. And of course, it's important to add that our interpretation of the environment or our experience of the environment can change, overnight, as we know from our own lived experience of the past year in the pandemic. And so this is why I think object relations is really so useful to us in terms of trying to do a cultural analysis of any kind. It shifts shape according to our experience, and it gives us a way of trying to formulate or at least encapsulate something of unconscious experience and the way in which our connections into mediatized culture impact on us at the level of mental experience, at the level of self-experience, at the level of emotional connection to the world. And so I think that helps us to escape that critique of universalism a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for anticipating what my next question was going to be, which was about the universals and of psychoanalysis, which I wanted to ask because this is back in the day when everybody used psychoanalysis for form analysis. That was always maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago, always the problem that I had with what I read of psychoanalysis and my experience that same as people are individuals and different, and we are not all the same. The same happens with cultural texts like films. But there are quite a few things that you have mentioned just now, which I think are very interesting from from the point of view of methodology of analysis, which is something that I think all of us, whether we are starting or we're in the middle or we are finishing, keep asking ourselves, how do we approach the analysis of culture, in our case, the analysis of films in cinema, in the best possible way. And I think one of the challenges that your approach highlights is, how do we talk about subjectivity objectively or academically?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we talk about texts? How do we incorporate into our analysis the impact of films or television series on the subject, mm-hmm. in a way which is not impressionistic? And I think this is something that I probably have discovered with your work, how one goes about this. And of course, the other thing that that kind of was a flash there when you mentioned the word messy, the messiness of life on our existence, if for nothing else, because an article that I was looking at, the proofs of mine recently, was included the word messy in the title. And so this is part of the same question: how do we harness? How do we remain faithful to the messiness of reality and to the incommensurability of different people's subjectivities in academic discourse? How do we turn all that chaos into shape in such a way that it becomes useful for us and for our listeners?
It's a really crucial question, and it's one that I grapple with all the time, as you can imagine, in terms of the demand of an academic, an intellectual pursuit of research to maintain standards of rigor and objectivity is very, very difficult when you're dealing with messiness and encounters that, by very definition, the very definition of the work that I've been trying to do, by the time it gets to the actual writing or the actual publication, which can sometimes be years later in the kind of with the long tail of publication times these days, everything has changed. And so for me, I try to kind of think about how to anchor the work that I'm doing with reference to material that isn't coming out of my own lived experience alone. So that might be drawing on newspaper reviews as a kind of objective measure of the tenor of an emotional response, or perhaps thinking about production contexts and thinking around interviews with key players in any given production, media production, whether that's a TV showrunner or a production house, or thinking around the data that we have. This is tricky because of the streaming kind of context, of course, but the data that we might have around consumption and reception, and the way in which these can be used to kind of test the hypotheses and test the ideas that we're running. As part of my training as an organizational consultant, I was introduced to the idea of a working hypothesis. And a working hypothesis is the idea that it's a kind of more philosophically true idea, a scientific idea, if you like, of a hypothesis, which is that you formulate a notion and then you set out to test it. But what you do is don't kind of treat the hypothesis as something that's fixed and inflexible. You learn. It's a kind of ongoing process of experience through learning. It's about testing the limits of your hypothesis and reshaping it in response to the data that comes up. And so I find that quite an interesting process and an interesting methodology in terms of trying to be responsive to the ideological or political context as well. And that's made me feel a bit bolder in more recent writing, in terms of, especially around Joker, my fury at the state of neoliberalism and so on. In that article, I think comes across. It's something I wrote very quickly, having been invited to write and under pressure, in terms of the context of all of the hellish experience that we've had in universities during the pandemic, for instance. But I think that it's, and being constrained, one of the things that I found about the piece that I wrote about Joker was that it was a very short article length. It was 5,500 words. So it needed to not kind of mess about with kind of defining concepts and defining the objective kind of setting, or the objective, the proof, as it were, of objective kind of purpose. It enabled me to kind of free something up and actually run with the political line. And I kind of felt that that working hypothesis was part of that experience for me. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there's something about objectivity, rigor. It's not the same in Spain at all, but in the UK, those of you who have any experience of the UK higher education context will know that we have this exercise called REF, where our work is assessed according to criteria of objectivity, significance, rigor, and originality. And those constraints have really kind of changed the way that people write. So there's something quite liberating, I think, in trying to find new processes and new methodological approaches that respond to the political moment, but that allow us to inhabit the work in ways that feel innovative. And in ways that feel, if not innovative, then at least creative in response to the cultural and political impulses that we're always kind of working in response to.
Yeah. And I think, going back to Joker, I think that the anger and frustration comes out loud and clear, and this is what I think found so appealing about the article, in a very academic way, because that's who we are. So we'll come back to that article in a minute. Perhaps my next question would be to ask you to talk a little more about what you refer to as the digital experience in your articles. How would you describe the digital experience, and how has it changed our lives, and how has it affected our analysis of audiovisual products as cultural critics?
Yeah, this is a huge question. I'll do my best to give you my account of this. So at the moment, I don't know if any of you are on Clubhouse, the new audio-led, it's called Social Audio. It's a new social media platform which just runs through audio. You have to have an iPhone to use it. I'm inundated with invitations. If anybody wants one, then, and you have an iPhone, then just message me in your number and I can send you an invitation. But in my encounters with Clubhouse and the audio conversations that are going on in there, I've become aware recently of this new notion of, it's a bit like Discord, Andres. I haven't been on Discord, so I can't talk about the similarities, but yes, the principle is very similar. There's an idea of the metaverse that I've been encountering. And at first I was like, what the hell is the metaverse? Just about got my head around the universe. Well, I haven't, obviously, that's the notion of the universe. And this idea of the metaverse and the idea of the way in which the digital realm is creating these alternative spaces in which we're now living our actual lives, or at least dimensions of our lives that feel actual, that feel real, even though they might be taking place in these digital spaces. So if you think about gaming, I know it's not film or TV, but if we think about gaming, and I'm not a gamer, I'm really interested in the way that players' avatars now kind of create a dimension of self-experience, and the way in which avatars more broadly in social media settings communicate aspects of our identity, communicate aspects of who we think ourselves to be. A pretty new phenomenon is this idea of non-fungible tokens and the kind of purchase of these digital artifacts that have no kind of material existence, but which are selling for phenomenal, ridiculously huge amounts of money, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency kind of transactions and so on. And this is now applying to in-game purchases. So for instance, you can buy skins or clothes for your avatars inside games. And you might have heard recently about, there's a brilliantly named company called Overpriced. In selling, they've sold this hoodie, this digital hoodie, as a non-fungible token for £19,000. It's kind of quite crazy. And if you look at games like Fortnite, for instance, they're currently making £220 million a month, that's estimated, from skins alone. So the kind of capital here and the transaction is extraordinary. Even Gucci is kind of making like £9 trainers for you to use in your augmented reality context. So I'm really interested in this. Why are people attracted to doing this and spending their money in these very ephemeral kind of digital contexts? So when I'm thinking about this, I think this has to be about self-experience, right? It has to tell us something about self-experience and self-exploration. And it's definitely not limited to the in-game purchases. So when I watch my young nephews playing their games, one of the things I notice is they might be playing particularly violent shoot-'em-up games, or, you know, football games or whatever it might be. And they're getting stuck into the emotional life inside that gaming experience, whilst also using their embodied voices to chat with friends in different places and to talk about very boring stuff, like I've got to get off the game in 10 minutes because my mum's making me clean the bathroom, or isn't that teacher a pain in the neck? You know, there's this kind of very strange emotional and psychological duality, or at least multiplicity, that seems to be going on. So there seems to be a kind of capacity in the digital world for us to live in multiple dimensions of experience at the same time. And I think this is quite an extraordinary development in terms of digital culture. And we're in the realm, I think, of very fluid borders and multiplicities and pluralities, borders between an embodied idea of the self and a digital version of the self, an avatar kind of life, if you like. And so that question of the boundary or the borderline between parts of self-experience is something I'm very fascinated by. I haven't done much work around this, but I'm beginning to think about it at the moment. And I know many of you in this group do so much valuable work around border spaces and border encounters. So I think it would be interesting to kind of map onto some of that work the psychological dimension of what's going on, the emotional dimension of what's going on. And there are certain concepts I could speak about, if you want me to, in the psychoanalytic world about borders and boundaries that are useful. I'm not sure if you'd like me to say anything about that.
Well, why not? Please say a little bit. That sounds good.
Okay, so borderlines are often, or boundaries are often in the psychoanalytic kind of context, are often couched in terms of dangerous experience, or at least experience that comes with some kind of sense of disequilibrium and a sense of being somewhere between very infantile experience and mature experience. So the border space is often, the psychological borderline spaces are often states of mind that are seen to be doing two things at once. On the one hand, being full of potential to be very defensive, very psychotic in terms of attacks and policing the kind of boundaries of experience, but also a kind of creative possibility in defending against the pain of maturity. Okay, the way in which in a mature state of mind we have to deal with emotions like guilt or anxiety or the need for reparation, restitution, and so on. So there's something about character and character formation that goes on in the border spaces. And when we're thinking about boundaries, there's lots of interesting work in the organizational psychoanalytic context around boundaries. And there's a wonderful writer called David Armstrong, who talks about how when boundaries are loosened or relaxed, this comes at a psychic cost. So what we're doing is we're sacrificing something at the psychic level in return for an experience of openness of some kind, for a culture of openness, if you like. And he observes that in this kind of setting, then the idea of hierarchy gets attenuated and creative play becomes more possible, creativity becomes more possible. But the risk is that we feel more incompetent or we feel more exposed, and that could be really destabilizing, sometimes even depersonalizing. And he shows how boundaries aren't impermeable, but that the emotional tow in transactions across boundaries is what seems to be so risky about that space. And that change shifts us in the boundary space towards what we can think of, I suppose, as like an underside or the shadow side of convention. So there's a kind of creative possibility that's also dangerous there. So it shapes a terrain for exploration, if you want, but it's also about the limits of the subject and whose authority dictates what's being defended. And the idea of cultural and presumably hegemonic politics comes to mind there. And then the last kind of conceptualization of it that I'll just mention is work done on the borderline state of mind by social workers, Andrew Cooper and Julian Lusada, who talk about how borderline states of mind are actually social experiences and not just individual experiences. So they point to something about what's going on culturally and politically, as well as what's going on in the depths of a sense of identity. And they show how when we're living with very painful experience, we need spaces into which to evacuate that experience and to kind of get rid of it so that we can't tolerate it. So there's a kind of sense of the borderland being occupied by expelled matter, if you like, stuff that's difficult to tolerate. There's kind of lots of scope there for, you know, exploring ideas of isolation or entrapment, contamination, abandonment, all kinds of different things. And they usefully formulate the experience of this borderline state, the borderland space, if you like, as an as-if experience. So it's as though we are experimenting with the possibilities of what it would be to step outside the boundaries and step beyond the borders into a place where things are a bit more risky and free-flowing. So it can look very calm from the outside, but because there's no real kind of psychological safety in the borderland, there's a lot at stake. And I was thinking about this, the work of Cooper and Lusada, Celestino, when I was reading your discussion of Before Sunrise, because I think it fits very well with the cosmopolitanism of that film and the issues that you raise in terms of the film's efforts to mobilize or perhaps even deny or reject difference and the social politics of the visibility of difference. So the below the surface dynamic, as I like to think of it, is quite revealing when we look at that trilogy of films, because it's putting on show the ideological effort that's required to inhabit the borderland space. But it's also an emotional effort. It's a psychological effort. It's not just ideological. It's highly ambivalent, as you say, in your discussion of monsters and Wonderland as well. So this borderland space and the idea of the borderline state of mind, I think, is really, really useful when it comes to the digital context. You also asked about screen media and film. I'll just say something briefly about that. And it's these media like TV, streaming, film, and so on. It's a more kind of, it's not passive, but it's more passive than gaming. It's passively consumed media, more passively consumed media. But nevertheless, the digital realm has made it less passive, because you now got phenomena like dual screening or co-watching online, and through apps like Teleparty or whatever it might be, an app that if you haven't used it, you can start a Netflix film so it starts on everybody's screens at the same time, and you can have live chat as you go through. So again,
I didn't know anything about this. My students were instructing me on it the other day because, of course, they are very used to this kind of thing. So yes.
Yeah. It's this idea that, you can't watch a TV show. Well, you can, but there's a kind of impulsion now to be on another screen and to be talking about it at the same time. And I'm very fascinated that this seems to kind of erode a kind of idea of solitude or aloneness, and the way in which that can be a creative experience in our encounter with media, and how the digital kind of context, the digital tools that we have, seem to be eroding that. At the same time, the digital tools seem to be putting us more in the frame of having a sense of contact with other people. So the kind of hunger for community, for communication, for somehow perhaps authenticating our own experience. It's like, in order to authenticate our experience of something, we need it to be seen or witnessed or acknowledged in some way. Yeah. My mind goes off on a tangent at that point when I say witnessing, because it makes me think of what's the deep-seated traumatic experience that we're trying to kind of drag up in ourselves at the moment. There's so much to say about that. Yeah. But I'll probably go off on a tangent. So I think intersubjectivity has really started to transcend the boundaries of usual face-to-face conversation, thanks to the development of digital communication tools and so on. I'm also interested in the kind of penchant for text-based chat as opposed to using the actual voice at the moment, and that's quite complicated, of course. In terms of what it means for us as cultural critics, I think we're back to that crucial idea of investigating audience experience, production and reception context, alongside analysing meanings inside text themselves. And it's really difficult to juggle all of that, of course, but I think trying to kind of keep all of those different contexts in place helps us to understand viewer experience and therefore the process of meaning making. So we need to kind of figure out how to track that and to work out whether what we're tracking is really about the dynamics of cultural politics, or whether it's about the dynamics of groups, or even it might be, I've never really thought about this before, but the dynamics of selfhood, now that selfhood seems to be such a plural idea. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes. You for just, like you said, I'll just put a few thoughts on the table on the psychological dimensions of how work on boundaries and borders is being done in psychoanalysis. And I thought that was wonderful because, and it has already made my mind start working and criticizing my own method, my own analytical practice, in that when I talk about borders and borders in films, I always want to make sure that borders, not everything is borders, and it's quite different to talk about geopolitical borders and the politics of and the realities of oppression and violence and so on in borders, and that's not quite the same. It's not good to equate that with the borders that exist between two people when they meet and blah blah blah. At the same time, what you have, very nicely and very forcefully proved in 5 minutes is how all of the experiences that we have and that we witness in films and that we analyze culturally, etc., on a social and a political level, probably have the impact that they have on us, because they're also working very powerfully on an emotional level, and they wouldn't make sense to us in the way they do if it wasn't because of the way in which it affects our psyche. It affects the way in which we understand ourselves and others. And so I thank you very much for that, because it makes sense. It makes sense that that what happens on a purely political level or a social level is because people react emotionally in similar ways, and although it's not film, you can see how emotional and the talk about border policing is nowadays in the extreme right. In Spain we just string one election after another, so they're always the political parties are always at it, and they're always saying these things. So it seems to me now that that we have to come to terms when we write about geopolitical borders. We have to come to terms with the psychological and the emotional dimension of it, because otherwise it's probably the explanation will be much poorer. Moving on, but linking with some of the things that you have just said, one of the things that I like about your research is how, as you say, you position yourself politically often in what you write, but at the same time you also manage to avoid the pitfalls of reductionism, which is something that one finds in so much ideological criticism, the way that this film is either conservative or progressive, and you seem to try to get away from that. For example, I have something that a note that I took at the end of the first of your articles on binge watching, and you say you talk about the challenges and opportunities of digital experience in our lives, how the compulsive desire to consume alerts us to what's missing in the experience of digital lives, in our experience of digital life, but at the same time, what the possibilities are for that. And this is something that comes to the front, I think, in your article on Joker. So that's something that I take away from your writing, your demand, I think, for nuance, for being able to look at things, in a more complex way than the either or kind of ideological bind that we often find ourselves in. But I wanted to move on, and I wanted to talk about feminism. And I wanted to ask you about this is something that is there in all of your articles, gender, but maybe focusing on what you say about Mad Men in the second of the articles in terms of cultural representations. I would like to ask you, how is the representation of the lived experience of women in the 1960s relevant for us, for 21st century individual? How do you feel about oppressed women? This is something that I took from your article, and I think immediately resonated. Oppressed women under patriarchy who are represented as happy. What's in general, what's the value of a feminist analysis of culture today? And what do you think are the contradictions, the possible pitfalls of, because nowadays we've, gone back to feminism with a vengeance, in a very different way from the 1980s and that. So as somebody who as a practitioner of feminist cultural analysis, how do you see what we are doing nowadays, what people are doing nowadays in terms of its values, its strengths and limitations? Many questions there, I'm sorry, but...
That's okay, there's lots there. It's really crucial. I think for me, meaning has always been made, it's quite an obvious thing to say, in the space between the image and the reader of the image. And I'm not sure that personally I've ever read an image of an oppressed woman who is being portrayed as happy as anything other than deeply ideological. So in other words, for me, a feminist approach makes it really difficult for me to read that apparent happiness as anything other than a symptom of oppression. So I'm coming at this from an education that's grounded in feminist and psychoanalytic principles, and perhaps this means that I'm constantly looking for manifestations of unconscious undercurrents of meaning when I'm looking at representations of apparently happy, oppressed women. And I was reminded of the work of Juliet Mitchell, which is foundational. You know, she wrote and published her landmark book, Psychoanalysis and Feminism, in 1974. And she was writing that book really as a defense of Freud, not because she thought that Freud was not one of the great patriarchs of our theoretical landscape, but because she could see that he was not prescribing, but was rather describing the operation of ideology. And so she was therefore arguing that the depiction of the workings of patriarchy doesn't equate to the perpetuation of patriarchal values. And so her argument is one that's absolutely fundamental to my methodologies, I suppose, which is it opens up a space to observe the operation of patriarchal ideology and therefore to critique it and therefore to dismantle it. So that's the kind of take on my relationship to those kind of images and to kind of thinking about Mad Men as feminists. It's really difficult to think about my initial experience of the show, which I'm sure was the same for many of you if you were watching it at the point of release. So it was a long, slow burn kind of experience. There was the kind of streaming structures that we have now were certainly not available in the UK context. And in fact, the UK context was maddening for me because the first season was shown on a Tuesday night on BBC Two at 10 o'clock. And, you know, weekly. And then the second season was bought by Sky. And, you know, I would refuse to kind of subscribe to Sky. And so therefore, I could have had to wait for years to kind of catch up. It was extremely painful. And I think something that you're getting at perhaps is the difficulty of watching the kind of representations of women's experience that are very painful if we're kind of thinking about characters like Peggy, for instance, or even Betty, and eventually Joan. There was very little room for the viewer to have an experience of cathartic release if you were watching in real time. And that, of course, is completely different now that we have streaming media where everything is, you know, bingeable and watchable at speed. And that's a really interesting philosophical and psychological kind of question in there about a capacity for forbearance, maybe. And it's something that reminds me about the importance of us paying attention to the broadcast structure of the show and what we're actually analysing in terms of accessibility to this experience. And I wrote about that a while ago in relation to In Therapy, the TV show with Gabriel Byrne as a therapist. And I was interested in the logic of the broadcast structure and the way that shifted over the life of the series. So I think that's also another kind of element of the methodological terrain that we're on here. And I think to come back to the idea of Mad Men and the feminist experience of watching it, I suppose, there's something about that slow burn structure of the show that meant that we were in emotional contact with viewer experience for a long period of time. And your question has kind of caused me to think about this as a kind of mimetic relationship. I hadn't really formulated that as a way of thinking about it before, but there's something about tapping into experience. I mean, for me, you know, my age meant that I was born in 1970, so the year that the show ended. And I was profoundly moved. I'm assuming that it's okay to give a spoiler.
I'm sure.
Is that okay?
No,
so
it's your problem. Yeah.
If not, then just mute me for a minute. But or kind of close your window, what have you. But the show ends with Don Draper, having his Californian moment of self discovery in a hippie kind of enclave on a hill overlooking the sea, thinking about and dreaming up the Coke advert. We'd like to teach the world to sing. And I grew up with that song. I remember that advert really, really clearly from my childhood. And I found it incredibly moving to be brought to a point at the end of a show where I had an actual personal point of memory and point of emotional contact associated with, you know, feel-good moments of my childhood and so on, that led to a very kind of emotional relationship to the ending of the series. And that's where I really started to think about the emotional labor that we're being invited into in the series. You know, as somebody who didn't live through the 60s, but who has studied second wave feminism, I was interested in, albeit a fictionalized kind of version of what women went through and the kind of slow burn arc of understanding something about the time that it took for these gains to start to be made, or indeed for the political terrain to even open up. So that's why I was trying to kind of connect that to what was happening in the shift between 2008, when the series started, and the late mid-teens, 2015, I think, when it finished. We saw that shift from a very kind of uncritical post-feminist kind of consumerist kind of logic of visible kind of female identity in popular culture to the emergence of a grassroots wave of fourth wave feminism, and a kind of colonizing of spaces around Me Too, for instance, and Black Lives Matter, that have kind of facilitated the emergence of a new and very vocal form of activism. And I think that, you know, we're at a point in history where, yes, feminism may be more visible than it's been for quite a sustained period of time, but it feels to me ever more crucial and ever more urgent. You know, I think we're seeing a very terrifying, speedy return to the kind of misogynistic structures that have long been resisted in our everyday lives, and that, you know, feminism is a very conflicted and complex force, social force, of course. But I think it needs, and I think, you know, we need as feminists to make sure that we are self-consciously intersectional, that we need to give voice first and foremost to ideas that come from out with the very deeply white and often very middle class history of feminist scholarship and the literature, the archive of the literature. Decolonizing that archive is the absolutely most urgent kind of academic task of the day, I think, and we need as feminists to prioritize that work. But of course, that's a really complex process as well. It can't be done overnight, and it needs time when at a point in history when things feel very pressured and urgent. So this reflexive kind of scrutiny of our practices and assumptions as white people and how we benefit from privilege also needs to be something that we factor into our everyday methodologies, I think. And again, it drives me back to the value of the psychoanalytic, which, you know, I'm constantly bearing that flag. But psychoanalysis is useful because it helps us to surface unconscious bias, it helps us to surface complexity, it helps us to surface difficult emotion, it helps us to be forced to confront uncomfortable truths. And so I find it really astute as a kind of tool in our little kit bag, if that makes sense. And I suppose for me, until I feel quite powerfully about this at the moment, but until the feminist line is the hegemonic one, the project is urgent, and we can't rest. I'm going to stop kind of, you know, beating my drum at that point.
And what we're seeing, certainly here in Spain at the moment, you know, in very clear terms, is how powerful the backlash is being in a matter of a couple of years. Blatantly patriarchal positions mixed with blatantly racist and anti-immigrant positions are bringing out, you know, millions of votes for people for parties who defend only that. And therefore, you know, I think it's a healthy reminder that when we feel that there is progress in a particular part of our experience, that progress is much more problematic and is much less widespread than maybe we thought. And therefore, you know, what you finished your answer with, that we need to, the project is just as urgent it has ever been, and we're very far away from the end, from the goal. I do want to come back to Joker, as I said, and a couple of things, particularly about your concept of or your description of empathy, which I would like to ask you about the difference between that and identification with the Joker, etc. But I think it's time to open the floor to the rest of the group and invite comments and questions. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
So, well, as I was saying, in order not to make this too long and tiring, especially for Caroline, maybe we can have another 10 minutes for your article on Joker, which the title is, pardon my French, Cracking Up Joker and the Mediatization of the Arse End of the World. And in this, Caroline gives us a very interesting analysis of the film. In terms, talks about concepts like the paranoid schizoid mentality caused by neoliberalism and populism. She talks about the what she calls the tired appeal of the superhero and white masculinity. Then she uses the concept of what called Metza, called the claustrum, that I wasn't familiar with, about the subject who has lost its way, having forgotten the qualities of home. And so she analyzes Joker in terms of the claustrum and the toxic environment. She talks about incel culture, which is very much, of course, was part of what the kind of reception and the response that Joker evoked. So Joker as an incel movie. She talks about the fecal other. Is that how you pronounce it? Fecal?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she finishes with a lovely call to send in the clowns, to speak the truth, which I very much like. So perhaps I'll just ask you one question, and it's about this idea that pervades the whole article, which is about the description of the realities and consequences of empathy with the Joker, which you explained also through the concept of the claustrum. So perhaps my question would be, can you expand a little bit on how empathy with a fictional character works in psychological terms, and how you see the concept of empathy as different from the concept of identification with a character?
So it's an interesting question. It's a bit complicated, so bear with me, but I'll try to be concise. So in the psychoanalytic account, empathy really works through what we understand as a very specific form of identification, which is projective identification. And this is a really specialized mode of identification that's used according to Melanie Klein, as one of our key kind of psychological processes, defense mechanisms, and so on. So Klein suggests that the process that underlies the feeling of identification with other people, because one has attributed qualities or attitudes of one's own to that person, that this has generally been taken for granted before she started to think more deeply about the psychological mechanisms in play. So she formulates the idea of projection, getting rid of something from inside ourselves. And she starts to think about how empathy in particular entails connection through projection. So the key element for Klein in empathy is projective identification. And she goes on to put it like this, and I'm going to read you a quote that I've got a note on. So we are inclined to attribute to other people, or in a sense, to put into them some of our own emotions and thoughts. By attributing part of our feelings to the other person, we understand their feelings, needs, and satisfactions. In other words, we're putting ourselves into the other person's shoes. Now, the ideas here are a little bit complicated to hang on to, and in a certain way, quite contradictory, but I remind you of what I've been saying about both and throughout this conversation. So when we put ourselves into the other's shoes, it's both, on the one hand, a matter of empathy, but also it's a way of getting rid of something that we are uncomfortable about in ourselves. So it's both these things at once. We put projective identification and empathy, in a psychoanalytic sense, allow us a way to be inside another person or another character, perhaps. So empathy becomes a kind of vehicle, if you like, because it's a vehicle for getting parts of ourselves out and into the other, while also therefore allowing us to heal our sense of self experience. So this is a very messy experience. And in this particular essay, I try to think about how Joker, the character of Joker, invites us into this messy, empathetic relationship. And I connect that to, again, pardon my French, there's no, and it's deliberate because I'm using the concept of the claustrum, which is understood as a rectal compartment of the mind for Donald Meltzer, the theorist who has written a book called The Claustrum. It's the film is very much dealing with the shittiness of experience and the messiness. I'm deliberately using that kind of adjective to describe it, because it is not just about the kind of toxicity of the environment, but it's also about the anal compulsions and the psychological compartments of the mind, and where we feel at home or alienated or lost and in pursuit of a kind of way out. And whenever I think about Joker, I am constantly reminded of Jean-Paul Sartre and Huis Clos, the untranslatable title of his play, Huis Clos. I don't know what it's called in Spanish, but the English translation is often No Way Out. And I think that the film kind of taps into this kind of sense of the mess that neoliberalism has got us into, leaves us with this terrible sensation that there is no way out. And how do we live with the toxicity that comes from that? And what I think the film does is to offer us a way of thinking about this bleak experience and thinking about the darkness of the experience that we see on show. And yeah, this idea of darkness I also find very, very useful. You also sent me a question, Celestino, about comedy, and I've kind of been thinking about darkness in relation to that. Do I have a couple of minutes to maybe speak to that?
Please.
So I've been thinking about darkness a lot in my work lately in terms of rage and anger. And there's a book chapter that I published recently on the work of the British comedian Sharon Horgan, and who's made shows like Catastrophe is her most famous one in the UK context, the comedy. And she also did, before that, she made a comedy called Pulling. And she has also worked with Sarah Jessica Parker on an international collaboration called Divorce. And I think her work, she's now done a deal with Amazon, so all of her work is on Amazon. But I've been thinking about rage in relation to feminism and comedy, and thinking about comedy as a kind of cover for deep-seated rage and anger, which is nothing new. You know, we've known about this for a long time. And it's not just Sharon Horgan, I just kind of choose her as a kind of exemplar, but you might think about Phoebe Waller-Bridge in Fleabag, or you might think about Tina Fey in the American context, or Michaela Cole, who's doing such extraordinary work. And if, by the way, if you haven't seen I May Destroy You, the Michaela Cole BBC series, I thoroughly recommend it, though it's not for the faint-hearted, nor is it a comedy, but it's got some very dark strains of humor running through it. When I'm thinking about darkness and kind of making these connections into politics and anger and rage, whether that's politics around neoliberalism or politics around feminism, I'm reminded of the way that another psychoanalyst called Wilfred Bion translated a letter that was written by Freud to Lou Andreas Salome, who was a female contemporary of his. And Bion translates a particular line in the letter and says, when conducting an analysis, by which he means a psychoanalysis, one must cast a beam of intense darkness so that something that has hitherto been obscured by the glare of illumination can glitter all the more in the darkness. It's an incredible kind of inversion of the way that we relate to light. And it's so powerful. I think there's so much of power in this line from this letter and the way it's been translated. And for me, it seems like a really useful way to think about Joker and its uses of comedy, because it seems to bring us to the edge of what's bearable. And I'm wondering if anyone knows of or can think of any other films that do that to us. And it also reminded me when I was thinking about this and preparing for today of Celestina's work on Wonderland and Monsters, where you talk about n-worlding. And I think this is a really, really fascinating, I will share the quote in a sec. The idea of n-worlding I find to be incredibly hopeful and incredibly powerful as a kind of political tool.
That's of course from William Brown, yeah.
Yes, and there's a lot about digital n-worlding in the literature on the metaverse as well. And I think that this, for me, that's so somewhere between this kind of shitty claustrum with its dark toxicity and the idea of being on the edge of what's bearable, and the hope. It comes back to Andres's question earlier, the flip side of all of that, which is the texture of hope and where we can kind of end-world ourselves differently. And for me, that's where the politics of identity now lie, and also the politics of the group and the politics of power. So I think that's what I wanted to say.
Of course, that did appeal to me because of my work on comedy, and because we still, some of us are still working on comedy, and it calls attention to. Thank you. It calls attention to the width of comedy, the wide spectrum of comedy that can go. I mean, that's even going back to Northrop Frye, etc. That can go from I don't know, romantic comedy to close to tragedy. And I mean, I can't think if your memory is beginning to fail. Never mind mine, but. I'm sure I can, with 10 minutes, I could think of other films, but I keep coming back to Shakespeare and to of course King Lear or other plays by Shakespeare, in which the line between the clown and tragedy is very, very, very thin, and I think Joker makes this explicit.